10 years ago today, in the halcyon days of 2014, PT, the playable teaser to Silent Hills, was released on the PlayStation Network. Developed by visionary game director Hideo Kojima, but disguised as an indie game by 7780 Studios, it wasn't until players completed its final esoteric puzzle that they discovered its true purpose: to announce the next entry in the beloved survival horror franchise, where Kojima will be joining forces with the illustrious Guillermo del Toro and Walking Dead veteran Norman Reedus. The release of PT led to a surge of enthusiasm for Silent Hill, as longtime fans and Kojima adherents united to solve the teaser's many mysteries and await the full release. For the former, PT represented an opportunity to return to the ghost town under the guidance of one of the industry's most talented creators. For the latter, it was a chance for Kojima to spread his wings, to at long last fly beyond the Metal Gear Solid cash cow, and break the fourth wall in a genre uniquely suited to his talents. But almost as quickly as PT was released and Silent Hills announced, the game was cancelled, and Kojima departed from Konami. Even a decade later, the demise of Silent Hills is a loss that's tough to fathom. Although Kojima continues to lead revolutionary projects and might even be reviving some of his horror ideas for OD, his upcoming collaboration with Jordan Peele, it's still a tragedy that Silent Hills never graced our PlayStation 4s and expanded on the nightmares we got from PT. It's still a tragedy that we're just now getting another Silent Hill game, a remake here in 2024, and that Kojima's game didn't drop in 17 or 18, as it likely would have in the event Konami hadn't canned it. That said, clocking in at around 45 minutes to an hour in length, there's plenty to discuss about PT itself. Its trademark Kojima prescience and meta-trickery, its symbolism and haunting narrative, its connections to the Silent Hill saga as a whole, how its imagery was reborn in Death Stranding, and what the teaser at large might suggest about Kojima's design priorities for OD. So join me, fellow traveler lost in the fog, as we take a look back at PT, better known as the playable teaser to Silent Hills. Before PT begins in earnest, it opens with a poem. Watch out. The gap in the door. It's a separate reality. The only me is me. Can you be sure that the only you is you? Right from the beginning, we're given a hint that the concept of alternate realities will factor heavily into the game to follow. This, of course, proves to be true, as PT's looping hallway, with its many variations, is the center point of the teaser. A full analysis of what I think Kojima was trying to get at here will have to wait until later in the video. But for now, this poem primarily serves as foreshadowing for the experience to come, and a warning that players shouldn't be surprised when they see the same damn hallway and the same damn suburban home time and time again. As the player regains consciousness, we're greeted with exactly the image all of us expected to see upon our return to Silent Hill. Two cockroaches fucking. Specifically, they're in the incredibly complicated moving and boning position. Don't try that one at home, adults. Or do. I'm not here to ruin your fun. Anyway, there are few themes more married than sex and horror, and leading off with a pair of bugs going at it should signal to any gamers with a weak stomach that they'd better be prepared to lose their lunch, because some disturbing shit is on the way. As others have pointed out in the intervening decade, if you look close enough right at the beginning, you can even catch a glimpse of the demo's antagonist, Lisa, who we'll be talking about plenty later on. Her ability to open this door from inside the hallway might suggest that she has some power to perhaps supersede the loops, or might even have some level of control over them. In any case, it's interesting that Silent Hills kicks off in first person, a viewpoint used in only one other game from the series, Shattered Memories, where all of Cheryl Mason's segments are in first person. Some of Harry's are too, but for the most part, the game uses the standard over-the-shoulder third-person camera for him. Shattered Memories is a bit of an experimental title, but I actually quite enjoyed it. I'm not sure how the larger Silent Hill community feels about it, but back in 2011, when I was in college, I spent many a drunken night watching my floormates play it, and marveling at the stunning differences in each of their playthroughs. Naturally, given that a first-person view wasn't the experience for any of the series' protagonists other than that alternate universe version of Charles Mason, no one expected this to be a Silent Hill game. But back to PT. The player begins in a claustrophobically tight, nondescript room, too dark to see much of anything other than the cockroaches I just mentioned. From there, it's through the door for the first of many loops through the game's signature hallway. As mundane as the hallway is, look around and you'll find plenty of signs of trouble. A torn-up portrait, discarded pill bottles and packages, empty beer and wine bottles, and most notably, a haunting news story playing on the radio. The story, which runs for a few minutes, describes how a suburban father snapped and murdered his entire family, including his pregnant wife. On the surface, this is standard horror stuff, and while we'll get into its application later on, what's interesting to me in terms of predicting the direction Kojima might have taken with the full release is the bit at the end, where the reporter links the killings to employment, childcare, and other issues facing the average family. When I was in college, I knew a guy who listened to exclusively indie music and chastised other people for asking him, or anyone else, for song recommendations, because you're, quote, supposed to discover indie bands on your own, man! Asking other people for help ruins the experience! If you went to college in the 2010s, you know the kind of milquetoast mouth breather I'm talking about. One of his other enduring opinions was that Arcade Fire's The Suburbs was meant to be a reflection of how growing up in the suburbs destroys your humanity, man! And not only is that one of the most privileged things I've ever heard in my life, it's also a statement that is directly contradicted by the band itself. You know, the people who wrote the fucking album. But I do have to give Mr. The Suburbs are the worst, man, some credit. He wasn't wrong that life in the suburbs presents a unique subset of societal issues. Not humanity-crushing issues, but issues that are indeed ripe for a horror setting. And they're exactly the ones mentioned in this radio broadcast. At the time, it was kind of flying under the radar, as few predicted the worldwide rightward lurch that took place in the mid-2010s. But there was indeed a great deal of unrest in the suburbs. As prescient as Kojima is known to be, with Death Stranding having essentially predicted the pandemic, and Metal Gear Solid 2 foreshadowing the internet age, I'm inclined to believe that this is exactly what he was getting at here. The issues of the suburbs do not deserve amplification above anyone else's, but they are uniquely harrowing. To borrow a few lines from the Joker, if a story like the one on the radio broadcast happens in the city or the country, it might make the evening news, but nobody would bat an eye. If a story like the one on the radio broadcast happens in the suburbs, it might make the national news, and everyone would lose their minds. Such tragedies aren't supposed to happen in the suburbs, and yet they do, despite the more idealistic portrayal of these regions. I'm willing to bet that's a topic Kojima would have explored in Silent Hills. For me, that phrase, things like this aren't supposed to happen here, hits particularly hard. As I've discussed before, I make these videos in my spare time in my basement. By day, I'm a special education teacher. For the first 7 years of my career, I worked at a low-income school for students with autism and emotional support needs. We never said the phrase, things like this aren't supposed to happen here, because the lives of these students were full of tragedy. Stories that don't reach the horrors of the radio broadcast, but are heartbreaking all the same. To say things like this aren't supposed to happen here would be an outright lie. For those students, it was reality. But during my time student teaching in the suburbs, at one of the more well-to-do schools in western Pennsylvania, we said it all the time, no matter how horrible the situation that befell one of our students, despite the fact that we kept saying it meant it couldn't possibly be true. Things like this aren't supposed to happen here is about as contradictory as a sign that says, "Welcome to Silent Hill." No matter how many times you speak it or read it, you know what's waiting on the other side. And in Silent Hills, I believe Kojima would have thrown that reality in our faces. There is actually more to this radio broadcast. By playing Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, which would end up being Kojima's last effort with Konami, you can find the same broadcast, but this time it kicks off with the phrase, "As the congressional debate over gun control flares up again." Gun control isn't a new topic for Kojima. He covered it from a military perspective in Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots. But bringing it up here, in the context of this family tragedy, gives the topic a whole new meaning. Here in the United States, the debate around gun control and the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which gives American citizens the right to keep and bear arms, is a hot-button issue. And there is, perhaps, nowhere this debate rages more than, you guessed it, the suburbs. In more rural areas of the country, guns are part of the local culture. Whether they're used for hunting or sport, your average rural American will tell you that for them, guns are just a part of everyday life. But in your typical college town, gun ownership is somewhat rare, and you'd be more likely to find folks willing to express the opinion that firearms should be more regulated. As a halfway point between America's college towns, cities, and rural countryside, the suburbs are increasingly a battleground for the debate around gun control and the Second Amendment. Growing up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, I went to high school with a kid whose father used to appear on Fox News in support of the idea that everyone should own a gun, and a kid who put together a walkout to protest gun violence. This type of ideological split can be found in suburbs everywhere, and even as the nation grapples with tragedies like the Uvalde massacre in 2022, there remains no consensus on how to deal with this crisis. It's a disturbingly unique bit of American suburban horror, knowing that these types of tragedies are always right around the corner, with no end in sight. The broadcast even touches on one of the central issues of the debate, the quick turnaround between the purchase of the gun, which happened 2 days prior, and the murder. In touching on this topic in precisely this way, I'm willing to bet that Kojima is hinting to the player that the characteristic, unspoken horrors of suburban America would have been at the forefront of Silent Hills. A deconstruction of the "things like this don't happen here" mantra. After listening to the radio broadcast, the player is then introduced to the crux of the game, the repeating, looping hallway. No doubt, the sight of the same scenery led many players to simply run to the end, luring them into a false sense of security that would then be immediately interrupted by the locked door awaiting them at the end of the hallway. In the meantime, someone begins banging on the bathroom door. To progress, the player needs to walk all the way back to the beginning of the hallway, at which point the stairwell door will open, allowing them to head down and proceed. I've also seen this door open after waiting for a significant amount of time. But of course, returning to the start of the loop is the best way to do it. It's some effective puzzle work that establishes an expectation in the player that they're going to have to think outside the box to solve the game's riddles. On PT's third loop, shit starts to get real. As the player approaches the door at the end of the hall, it shuts on its own. Upon reaching it, the bathroom door creaks open, just enough to peer inside. Bugs scurry out from the opening, and inside, a baby starts to cry. The sound of the baby crying alone is particularly disturbing. When I reached this point in the teaser, my cats, who were sitting beside me on the couch, looked up at the TV screen in concern. The eldest of the pair, a 9-year-old black cat named Dusty, who we often joke seems to fancy herself as a therapy cat, even put her paw on my forearm, as if telling me there was something I needed to take care of. I have 2 daughters, and she always did her best to look out for them when they were infants, so I can't say I'm surprised that the sound of a clearly distressed child caught her attention. But still, major credit to the sound engineers on this one. The way the baby in the bathroom cries here really strikes a chord, for both humans and our feline companions. From here, the only way to progress is to use R3 to peer into the bathroom, at which point the player will have their first real encounter with Lisa. After glaring at the player, she'll quickly close up shop, and the stairwell door will unlock. It's at this point, in my experience, that most players realize just how horrifying an experience they're in for. After 3 hallway loops, where things grew progressively, quietly disturbing, they've at last laid eyes on the real monster that's after them. After PT dropped, my friends and I made a habit of having each other take turns playing it in the darkness. For those who were on their maiden voyage, the sight of Lisa's undead ghostly face peering through the gap in the door was enough to make them question whether or not they wanted to keep playing. Despite ratcheting things up, PT continues its slow burn for the fourth loop. I'm sure it was probably tempting for the developers to hit the gas pedal at this point, but they show incredible restraint in laying off the high heat and returning to the status quo. It gives players a quick, temporary breather, a chance to contemplate what they just saw, and more importantly, the sight of the same simple hallway puts them at ease, a feeling that is broken by the sound of a woman crying on the radio. Anticipation builds as the player walks down the hall to find Lisa standing in the dim light of the foyer. Her unnaturally tall appearance, supported by what appears to be large high heels, makes her look particularly monstrous, and her signature tilted head is an image the player will soon become quite familiar with. But just like any good horror director, Kojima denies a full look at Lisa just yet. We've yet to suffer sufficiently, yet to reach the point where we will be truly and utterly terrified by our tormentor. After a brief period of time, the foyer light will go out, leaving players with no choice but to wade into the darkness, where Lisa might very well be waiting for them. It's brilliantly meta, serving up a moment like this. Again, thinking back to watching friends of mine play this, I remember several of them throwing up their controllers and refusing to move forward. But there's no other choice, nowhere else to go in the confined hallway. And yet again, Kojima and company are just toying with us. When the player reaches the spot where Lisa, roughly, was standing, the lights come back on, and cockroaches dance along the walls. While I'm on the topic, many have drawn a connection between Lisa's association with roaches and Pyramid Head, as the bugs are also known to follow him. I wouldn't be surprised if it was something Kojima had on his mind while working on this, but I wouldn't take it to the bank either. Cockroaches have long been a staple of the horror genre, and certainly fit Lisa's undead appearance, regardless of their link to Silent Hill's begrudging mascot. At the start of the fifth loop, the hallway is once again submerged in darkness. The bathroom door swings open, inviting players to see what's been hiding inside. On the floor, a light flickers on and off, a flashlight that the player will then carry with them for the rest of the demo. Out of everything in PT, this is its most obvious nod towards the Silent Hill series as a whole. Finding a flashlight in exactly this manner is a seminal moment in every one of the games, the type of thing you can bet on happening within the first half hour to an hour or so. It's so Silent Hill-like that many unsuspecting players probably said, "Oh wow, this is just like how Silent Hill does it," unbeknownst that this is not so much a reference to the franchise as it is the developers informing them that no matter how different Silent Hills would have been, they intended to honor the past wherever possible. Illuminated by the flashlight, the players can see the disgusting bathroom in all its glory. Back when I was a regular Warhammer 40,000 player, a hobby I have since, unfortunately, retired from, for the sole fact that all my friends who play are back in Pittsburgh, where I went to college, we spent many a Friday and Saturday evening engaging in tabletop warfare at a game store in the suburbs of the Steel City, with a bathroom so putrid it had a sign in front that said, "Women, please ask to use the staff restroom." The stench of urine clung to the place, like the smell of cigarettes in the home of a lifelong smoker, and hit your nostrils with fury the minute you approached it. We called it Nurgle's bathroom. It was that fucking bad. And yet, it had nothing on this bathroom, with its filthy walls, obscured mirror, and bathtub filled with dirty water. Unfortunately for the player, you can't simply leave it. As soon as you pick up the flashlight, the door closes behind you. To continue, you'll need to take a look in the sink, where you'll at last find the source of the crying. A misshapen, tormented fetus. It's an obvious reference to the radio story from earlier, something we'll dive into later. But damn, if this isn't one of the most bone-chilling creatures I've ever seen in a video game. It was creepy as hell in 2014. And a decade later, now that I have 2 children of my own, it's even worse. It's also here that, to my knowledge, the player experiences what the community has since referred to as a haunting. Hauntings begin when the baby cries, followed by static on the radio and some atmospheric music. During hauntings, the player can be caught by Lisa, something you'll see for yourself momentarily. You can also hear Lisa's footsteps, and if you've got a headset plugged in, you might even hear her talk to you. This happened on my very first playthrough of the game, and if you'd like to sleep soundly tonight, I sure as hell wouldn't recommend trying to get that to happen. But hey, if you can't help yourself, then just say her name into your microphone a few times. You might be surprised at what happens. Once the haunting is passed, in order to escape the bathroom, the player will need to look at the bathroom door through the mirror, at which point they'll be free to return to the looping hallway. In the 6th loop, the scenery shifts slightly, but noticeably. The lights are now out in the main part of the hallway, but on in the foyer. Naturally, this lures players into yet another false sense of security, this time about the foyer. Again, fantastic subversion of expectations. The radio broadcast from earlier is playing too, but this time it's interspliced with someone talking directly to the player, urging them not to turn the dial, because they're just getting started, telling them not to trust the tap water, repeating a series of numbers that will come into play later on, 204863, and finally uttering those famous last words, "Look behind you." On my first blind playthrough of PT, well, somewhat blind, I knew it was a teaser to Kojima's Silent Hills, but I knew little else about it. I told the radio man to fuck right off and refused to look behind me. Why the hell would I listen to a guy like this in a horror game? Unfortunately, unless you've read the game guide, there's no other way to progress here. You have to look back during a haunting and get murdered by Lisa to continue. Lisa's attack is far and away PT's most iconic moment, one that's been played and replayed on the internet over and over again the last 10 years. Functionally, it's a jump scare, but it's so much more than just a mere startling. The full view of Lisa's features, her gnarly teeth, her gouged out eye, and godskin pale flesh tell a story all its own. Lisa breaks the player's neck in brutal fashion and tosses them to the floor, giving them a final glimpse of the hallway. As for the noises that follow, I'll leave what happens there up to your imagination. After getting far closer with Lisa than the player ever wanted to, they wake up back in the starting room. With flashlight in hand, more details become visible, including the tally marks on the walls, which, as I see it, imply that our character has been stuck in this loop for far longer than we've been in control of them. Trapped in the same hallway for an eternity, and getting haunted to death, and worse, by Lisa. That's a special kind of hell if you ask me. In the back of the room, the player can also find a bloody brown paper bag which will begin talking. Some have theorized that this might be the severed head of the father from the radio broadcast. More on that later. Regardless, Baghead says they could do nothing but walk, until they saw another version of them walking in front of themselves. Baghead then concludes with the same poem from the beginning, tying all that's happened so far together with the start of the game. If it isn't clear enough at this point, Baghead's words drives PT's story home. The player character is trapped in an alternate reality, Kojima's interpretation of Otherworld. Like the Silent Hill games of old, the sins of the father in the radio broadcast have created a psychological hell from which we must escape. And now, there's nothing left to do but head back into the hallway with our trusty flashlight and figure out how to do just that. Returning to the hallway, the player finds it exactly as they left it, with the opening portions dark, the foyer lit, and the story of the father who murdered his family playing on the radio, with the same additions from the narrator spliced in, of course. From here on out, hauntings can continue to occur, meaning that the player needs to be on guard, lest they want to, once again, get murdered and falanu halalu'd by Lisa. Whew, that was a deep cut. Sure hope someone gets the reference. It was wise, in my opinion, to do this. To throw the player, who's likely still reeling from their first encounter with this lovely lady, back into a situation where they're still at risk of being attacked by her. It increases the tension and sends players frantically looking through the hallway in search of whatever it is they'll need to progress to the next loop. The solution can be found on the picture frame next to the radio, which bears the instructions, gouge it out, and the letter X. As you'll see in the loops to follow, this kicks off a series of tasks that are particularly meta, the kind of gameplay mechanics Kojima has been experimenting with ever since Psycho Mantis read your memory card and called you out for sucking at Castlevania back in 1998. So to unlock the next loop, you simply need to look at the picture and press the X button, or the cross button, as some PlayStation purists insist on calling it, which gouges out the woman's eye, thus confirming that Lisa is indeed the woman pictured throughout the hallway. On the way to the next loop, the player will also find a message above the doorway. "Forgive me, Lisa. There's a monster inside of me." No doubt a letter from the, at this point anyway, unnamed husband to his murdered wife, the message seems to hint at some form of demonic possession. This is not necessarily a new topic for the series, but if that is indeed what precipitated the husband's downward spiral, it would be a far more literal application of the concept than what we're traditionally used to seeing in Silent Hill. The seventh loop maintains the same hallway lighting, but the radio broadcast is no longer playing. Upon reaching the foyer, Lisa fucks with us again by throwing down a window pane. Yet another jump scare thrown in at exactly the perfect time. If you look up, you can even see her on the second floor balcony looking down at the player. It's interesting to note that although Lisa can be seen in various locations throughout the game, at which point she can fly towards the player and thus make death at her hands inevitable, there's no such risk here. So feel free to get another glimpse at her nasty visage, if you dare. The 8th and 9th loops, for me personally, might be the most disturbing of all. The light in the foyer is now red, and the swinging chandelier has been replaced with a dangling refrigerator. Dripping with blood and tiny handprints, you can hear the moaning of a pained child coming from inside. The radio broadcast plays as well, but only the part about how the father hung himself with a garden hose in the garage. Listen carefully enough, and you'll hear that the word umbilical cord overlays the garden hose. Obviously, hanging oneself with an umbilical cord would be a complicated and likely futile process. Well, as long as we're only talking about the part that they let you take home from the hospital. But it all serves to continue to paint the strike zone with the domestic, suburban themes that have been dominating the demo's environmental storytelling since we first entered the hallway and heard the initial radio broadcast. On the 9th loop, the bathroom doors again open, allowing players to get another look at the fetus in the sink. But this time, the refrigerator is swinging wildly, and a child can be heard frantically screaming inside. Some have theorized that the spirit of the daughter of the family, who the father lured out of hiding by saying he was just playing a game before shooting her at point-blank range, is trapped inside. Between the screaming and the swinging fridge in the crimson light, there's just something about this part of PT that always gets to me. My cats agreed, as they both stared up at the TV screen, very concerned for the well-being of the screaming child. To continue, the player must engage in the second of the demo's truly meta tasks. On a previous loop, you'll find the phrase, "I can hear them calling me from," written on the wall in the foyer, in the same handwriting as the message to Lisa. On this loop, you'll find the word, "hello," again, in the same handwriting, on the wall next to the phone. By looking at the word "hello," the player can carry the letters down to the message in the foyer, until it reads, "I can hear them calling me from hell." Again, given that this phrase has the same handwriting as the message to Lisa, we can conclude that it must come from the same source, her husband. Between the references to hell and monsters, it sure seems like he was possessed by some kind of demonic entity. But we'll talk more about that later. Once the message has been fully transferred, you'll get that good old satisfying PT door click, and the demo's 10th loop will commence. For this loop, the hallway is once again dark, and the red light returns, but it's slightly brighter, because it's now coming from the chandelier, which is returned to the scenery. A different broadcast is playing on the radio this time around, and it's in Swedish. A full translation can be found here, in this awesome video by Sir Dative Gaming. But to summarize, it goes like this. The broadcast starts by telling the listener to close their eyes and listen to his words, asks if they can hear the screaming of their own soul, and says they are now faced with a choice, to follow him or continue to be mired in their own torment. The broadcast subject then shifts, explaining that all of this stems from an audio drama from 75 years ago, which, in fact, turned out to be true. As a result, an unknown they has taken control of the populace at its highest levels, and thus, the police and the news cannot be trusted. The speaker then offers to make those who are listening one of them, as their master, apparently, can stop all of this. They then say that a portal to a new dimension will soon open, before repeating that same sequence of numbers again, 204863. There are a couple of ways this broadcast could be interpreted. First, let's talk about the radio drama from 75 years ago. This is an obvious reference to War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, a science fiction novel about an alien invasion written in the late 19th century. Famously, when it was adapted into an audio drama in 1938, 75 years from the writing and development of PT, some listeners thought it was real news, and believed the United States had actually been invaded by an extraterrestrial army. So, in my opinion, the simplest interpretation of this Swedish broadcast is that it's a cheeky nod to Silent Hill's well-documented history of including a comedic alien ending to its games. Just about every entry in the franchise has one, as it's become something of a running gag dating all the way back to Silent Hill 1. But there is, of course, more to it than that. Given that we seem to be dealing with demonic possession, from the father chanting a sequence of numbers like a strange spell, to commenting that he has a monster inside of him, it might instead be that this broadcast is suggesting that demons, not aliens, have taken over the populace and are preparing to act. Yet, as mentioned earlier, this is suburban horror we're dealing with, and there are few subjects more engrossing to your average air monarch wearing suburban dad than the simple concept that the world has been taken over by a secret society of some kind, and that only by wading through hidden truths and deprogramming your brain can you prepare yourself for what's to come. In my opinion, I'd wager it's a little bit of both the demons and the suburban horror. Given the history of the franchise, with a mix of cult-focused entries like Silent Hill 1, 3, and 4, and more psychological ones like Silent Hill 2, Shattered Memories, and Downpour, an understanding of both is essential to making a good entry in this series. And while you do ultimately need to pick a side, you can play within the margins for at least a little bit. I think that's what Kojima was doing here, toying with the two potential approaches to a good Silent Hill to figure out which one worked best for him. And for the record, no, I'm not saying Downpour was good. I think it was just fine, but if you're looking for a psychological Silent Hill, the best is clearly Silent Hill 2. Though, as mentioned, I'm also a big fan of Shattered Memories. The 11th loop is the one where the gameplay and scenery changes the most. That's not saying much considering it's just an adjusted version of the looping hallway, but still, it was a good choice on the part of the developers to mix it up here, considering we've been seeing the same damn level with small variations for the last half an hour. In the 11th loop, the player moves at breakneck pace through a truncated section of the hallway, all of it bathed in crimson light. It's disorienting, and seems to be an attempt at visually recreating a state of extreme drunkenness. Based on the previously mentioned pills and empty bottles of wine and beer, I'm fairly confident in saying that is exactly what they were going for here. After speeding through the hallway, and by the way, it's easy to turn around and get lost, as I myself did for about 5 minutes on this playthrough, the player will eventually notice that one of the pictures has fallen off the wall, exposing a peephole into the bathroom. peering through it will play a horrifying scene of a radio host telling his listeners, all of those folks who lost their jobs and welfare, to rise up and take action because society is rotten to the core. We then hear Lisa's husband respond to this by killing her and cutting something, no doubt the fetus, out of her stomach. At least, that's what it sounds like to me. You're welcome to disagree. While the radio broadcast from earlier might not be referring to what happened to Lisa and her husband's family, and instead a different set of folks who suffered a similar tragedy, what happened to Lisa herself is beginning to become more clear. Her husband murdered her with a knife and forcibly removed the unborn child from her womb. But why? Was it solely because of the propaganda of a radio madman? The answer, of course, is more suburban horror. If the player enters the bathroom and looks down at the fetus in the sink after witnessing the murder, the fetus will speak, telling the following story.
You got fired, so you drowned your sorrows in booze. She had to get a part-time job working a grocery store cash register. Only reason she could earn a wage at all is the manager liked how she looked in a skirt. You remember, right? Exactly 10 months back.
If conspiracy theories are red meat for your average suburban dad, then there's probably no fear greater for their demographic than this one. Getting fired from your job, failing to provide for your family, forcing your wife to work harder, and then losing her to an affair with her creepy boss. It's a tale as old as time. Back in the Renaissance, there were plenty of plays about unscrupulous priests that went just like this one. Once again, Kojima is tapping into the anxieties of the middle class to create a brand of horror that is so often unspoken and typically left to Lifetime dramas and the opening stanzas of dude movies like Hot Tub Time Machine, but is no less potent when applied to such a genre. It might seem mundane or buried beneath the ebbs and flows of modernity, but when exposed for how dark and terrible it can be, does indeed create a disturbing tapestry of fear. After listening to the fetus, the player can depart the bathroom and return to the hallway, which is largely returned to normal, the same way it was at the very start of the demo. The door at the end of the hall will be locked, however, stopping progression. Shortly thereafter, the game will begin to glitch out. It will start with ripples on the screen, followed by someone repeating that same sequence of numbers, 204863, more screen tearing, a baby crying, and finally, a true terror the likes of which you probably haven't seen since the original PlayStation. And if cheating is a classic suburban dad fear, then there's probably no more classic fear for a gamer than getting an error like this and being forced to start over, which is the illusion PT gives you, as after about 30 seconds, you'll see the game's intro screen, complete with the opening poem once again. So too will you wake up in the same room from the beginning, just without the fucking cockroaches. Guess they're done boinking for now. Back to the error screen for a moment, there are a number of such screens, each one in a different color and in a different language. Right in time for the final loop and puzzle, this kicks off yet another meta theme, one Kojima would continue to explore in Death Stranding: community cooperation. Piecing together the game's final puzzle, especially in a manner that worked reliably, became something of a group endeavor. It started with the error screens, but continued with the discovery of several pieces of a picture found throughout the demo, including one piece that's hidden here, in the menu. Each time a piece of the picture is found, a phrase in a different language is displayed on the screen. The complete message, altogether, appears to read, first, in Portuguese, I whispered your name, but the wind of the night took your voice away. Then, in Italian, I didn't move any more during the waiting. Then his finger slipped on my hand. Next, in Japanese, it was a cold hand. Body was trembling. The fourth message is in English and reads, never moving a step, his hand in mine, I waited for it to pass. And finally, in German, and through the mist of fading consciousness, I believe I heard a phone. Upon gathering all the pieces, the portrait of a woman who, again, can only be Lisa, can be found in the hallway, along with something of a poem which reads, "My voice, can you read it? This sign, can you hear it? I'll wait forever if you just come to me." Multiple sources, including the website Silent Hill Memories, who I took it from myself, have pieced this together. But among the first to do it was the YouTube channel The Great Debate, who published several amazing videos on PT that to this day are helping people both solve the final puzzle and understand the game. The Great Debate's interpretation of these clues is brilliant, and their solution to the final puzzle has always worked for me. The solution is as follows. Enter the loop and wait at the beginning of the hallway for the clock to strike midnight and a haunting to begin. Then, when the haunting is over, walk exactly 10 steps. Once you've done so, a baby should laugh. Then, stand still, and when a haunting begins again, say Jareth, which the Great Debate believes to be the name of Lisa's husband, into the microphone. I've also had this work by simply saying Jay. At this point, the baby should laugh a second time. Then, the controller will start to vibrate. Stay still, and when the vibration is over, the baby will laugh once more, and the phone will ring. Upon picking it up, a voice will tell the player that they have been chosen, and you'll get that wonderful PT door click for one final time. Upon exiting the loop, the player will receive what, in some ways, can be viewed as a conclusion to the demo's story arc, as the voice of the radio host, the unhinged one, not the standard newscaster guy, describes how boring his dad was, and how one day he went ahead and killed them all, but couldn't even be original about the way he did it. This is a clear reference to the similarities between the family massacres mentioned in the original broadcast, and the appearance that they're part of a pattern. So perhaps this is supposed to be the voice of the unnamed son from the broadcast, who's the only member of the family we haven't heard from to some extent. We've received messages from Jareth, maybe even heard from his head, been attacked by Lisa, heard the daughter screaming inside the fridge, and got some exposition from the fetus. And now, the son has chimed in. But the primary interpretation of this segment, and the one I agree with the most, is a meta-commentary on the state of the Silent Hill franchise. As most longtime fans will agree, the first 3 entries to the series are universally beloved. But from Silent Hill 4, The Room, all the way down to Downpour, the entries have been increasingly divisive. Perhaps even boring, some would argue. If you're a longtime viewer of this channel, then you know I am an overwhelmingly positive guy by nature, to the point where I describe my content as restorative, in search of the best possible take on a developer's intentions. But let's not mince words here. From the middle 2000s to the early aughts, the Silent Hill franchise lost its way. I have fond memories of playing Downpour and Homecoming in a dimly lit living room on late summer nights with my brother and cousin. And yet, the nostalgia of those experiences cannot hide the fact that those games simply were not up to the incredible standard set by the opening trilogy. By 2014, it was time for change, for new toys. And that's what Kojima seemed to be hinting at with this closing monologue. It's then that the player is rewarded with the real teaser for Silent Hills, featuring a star-studded collaboration between Kojima, Guillermo del Toro, and Norman Reedus. In the brief scene, we see Reedus' character, who modders have since confirmed is the same character we're playing in the teaser, walking through a cityscape at night, following a trail of blood, as the streetlights of Silent Hill flicker around him. Finally, the demo concludes with the title screen for Silent Hills, with the final S appearing later. And so ends the entirety of PT's content, and all we'll ever see of Silent Hills. So let's piece together what we can about the overarching story, and then dive into the elephant in the room. What happened to the game, where Kojima's career went from there, and how hope has recently emerged that we might soon find out some of what the visionary director would have done with Silent Hills in a different form. As noted by the demo, the story of PT would not necessarily have had any impact on the events of Silent Hills. But PT itself does have a story to tell, and as I've said throughout this video, I believe it's one of suburban horror interspliced with the supernatural. As with anything created by Hideo Kojima, the work is interpretable, and nothing I say here should be taken as fact. This is just my own personal analysis of the story. But I do indeed believe that Lisa's husband was possessed by a demon, possibly one affiliated with the cult of Silent Hill, which awoke in him after all those classic suburban fears. Alcoholism, economic strife, and infidelity took their toll. Perhaps the demon was even responsible for this chain of events. Again, that's just the story I personally picked up on during my multiple playthroughs of the game over the last 10 years, but I'd be very interested to hear your own takes down in the comments. And again, though it isn't a certainty that anything from PT would have made its way into Silent Hills, I do think the theme of suburban horror is something Kojima and company would have continued to explore in the full game. Not only would it align with his tendency to tie real-world events to his games, but suburban horror just fits very naturally with the town of Silent Hill. I don't know if you've ever been to the New England area, where the haunted resort town is set, but it really is a bunch of cozy, suburban towns that stretch all the way to Boston. And to an extent, when you think about it, part of what made the first 3 Silent Hill games so powerful is the fact that, at their roots, they deal with everyday suburban difficulties. Silent Hill 1, at its core, is about a man losing his daughter, a primal parental fear. Silent Hill 2 is about a man reeling from the death of his wife following a bout with terminal cancer, and all of the awful emotions that accompany it. Traditional, red meat masculine horror. And what is Silent Hill 3 about if not an unwanted pregnancy? For many women in suburban America, there is nothing more terrifying. I am, of course, aware that this is a vast oversimplification of the 3 plot lines, that the cult is heavily involved in the events of Silent Hill 1 and 3, and that James has his wife's literal body in the back of his car in Silent Hill 2. But when you dig up the dirt and look at the seeds of the story, they are all examples of suburban, everyday narratives. The mundane blended with the supernatural, psychological horror the franchise is known for. So not only would this approach have made sense geographically and socially, but it would have returned the series to its barest roots. As for the S at the end of Silent Hills, some have speculated that the game might have dealt with the protagonist, played by Norman Reedus, visiting the personal Silent Hill, or personal hell, of multiple individuals. Separate realities bound by passing through gaps and doors, perhaps. As noted throughout the series, many characters, from the abused Angela Orozco to James Sunderland himself, have their own versions of Silent Hill and Otherworld where the horrors are unique and specific to their past traumas. PT seemed to be about a hell of Jareth's making, and it's not hard to imagine the greater campaign of Silent Hills focusing on several similar stories like this one, featuring loops and puzzles that evolved in much the same way. In terms of gameplay, I'm willing to bet that it would have been a lot like what we saw in the demo, just on a larger scale. I can't imagine it would have been in first person. Why pay for the rights to Reedus' mug if you're only going to see it in cutscenes? Third person, I wager, would have been more likely. Which is a bit of a shame, because I do think that the first person point of view, despite it being an unorthodox approach for the series, worked for Kojima's style. I doubt the looping concept would have returned, at least not as a major feature, but maybe we would have seen it here and there in puzzle-based sections. Puzzles, I do suspect, would have been a central feature of Silent Hills, more so than it's ever been for the series. I'll bet its gameplay would have been propped up by the more easily solvable ones, like Gouge It Out, and the one where you had to carry the letters down the hall, with a few tentpole brainbusters that would have compelled community cooperation, just like with the final puzzle of PT. Now, all of this begs the question, would Silent Hills have been a good game? Well, obviously I wouldn't be making this video if I didn't believe in what was coming wholeheartedly. But in all honesty, my bet is that it would have been beloved by Kojima adherents and critics alike, and the type of game that brought in a new audience for the series, something studios always love. But at the same time, I'm fairly confident in saying that it probably would have been pretty controversial among longtime Silent Hill fans. Although PT references the history of the franchise here and there, Kojima isn't really an IP guy, and I have a hard time imagining him going about the narrative in a way that wouldn't have made pretty significant changes to the lore. I do think it would have honored past games, especially the first 3 entries, but likely done some very different things with the Cult and Otherworld. Though I don't think he would have dragged out Pyramid Head for another run, so that's definitely a plus. But still, all of that is just my personal speculation. We'll never know what Silent Hills would have been like, because in April 2015, less than a year after the game was announced, it was cancelled. In a decision both cowardly and, dare I say, anti-art, Konami went so far as to remove PT from the PlayStation Store. The gameplay you're seeing here was captured on a PlayStation 4 purchased just a few months before the demo dropped, and though it's definitely on its last legs, to the point where I sometimes can't even connect a controller to the damn thing, old girl held on for this one. When I decided to do this video back in April, I wasn't sure if she would make it this far, but she did, and if she goes to the great gig in the sky tomorrow, it'll all be worth it. The following December, Kojima left Konami for good, with the intention of reforming his company, Kojima Productions, as an independent studio. The reasons for his departure differ depending on who you ask, but there are plenty of plausible ones, including the fact that Konami was changing their business model to focus on mobile games, and even promoted a president with experiences in such titles around the time of his departure, to the fact that Kojima had, perhaps, gotten a bit too big for his britches, talking openly about industry issues in interviews, becoming something of a rock star director, as evidenced by his appearances at award shows and alongside folks like Jeff Keighley, spending significant amounts of money on partnerships with big-name actors, and taking longer than some felt was necessary to complete his games. Kojima adherents, on the other hand, argue that Konami, either because of the changing priorities of the studio or issues with him personally, had been creatively stifling him for years, perhaps best evidenced by the fact that he never wanted to make a sequel to Metal Gear Solid, but got strong-armed into it, and that the Phantom Pain was shipped without its final mission, a quest that would have essentially tied the whole series together. Though I am a self-proclaimed Kojima fanboy, something that should be clear by the tone of this video, even I must admit that fault probably lies on both sides. There's no doubt that Konami had a different, quick cash-focused business mindset in April 2015, that Metal Gear Solid 5 was taking longer than the company had expected, and that Kojima's risk-taking artistic mindset is surely the type of thing that gives money-conscious executives heart palpitations. But as Hidetaka Miyazaki, director of the Soulsborne series, said in a recent interview, paraphrasing a former director of Nintendo, people who are afraid of losing their jobs are afraid of making good things. Miyazaki and Kojima are polar opposites in the way they make games and tell stories, but I have no doubt that they share this same philosophy. As both a critic and a writer, that's a maxim that I myself can get behind. So, as I see it, the lion's share of the blame falls with Konami for mismanaging their talent. Say what you will about Kojima, but there aren't many other directors out there who are willing to be so innovative, and there's basically no one who's managed to bring as many big-name Hollywood talents onto their projects as him. Losing Kojima is something Konami should have avoided at all costs, but they did, and thus he went off to start his own independent studio. Whether this has been a successful endeavor largely depends on your opinion of his first, and so far only, project since setting out on his own, Death Stranding. Despite my personal appreciation for Kojima, I'm well aware that he is not for everyone. The same is true for Death Stranding. To some, Death Stranding is an overstuffed mess of cutscenes, noun soup, and esoteric world building that occasionally mixes in a walking simulator, with precious little quote, Strand gameplay, the unique genre Kojima promised to introduce in the 2019 title. But to me, it's a beautifully human story that predicted the pandemic, makes a touching statement about the many things that connect the diverse human race, and perhaps most importantly, gets better every time I play it. When I finished Death Stranding for the first time around Thanksgiving of its release year, I have to be honest in saying that though I enjoyed the narrative, I didn't quite understand what the hell a Strand game was. Even after linking into the chiral network, I was building so many structures that the gameplay felt more like a Minecraft delivery mod than anything else. But when I played it in 2020 with my wife, I had a completely different experience. By then, each time I connected a region to the chiral network, the map exploded with community creations. bridges, roads, fucking zip lines that made traversing the terrain not only faster, but incredibly enjoyable. It helped that I was playing on a lower difficulty, as I always do in my wife's backseat games, but that still doesn't account for the breakneck pace with which we sped through my second run on Death Stranding. A 40-hour experience was suddenly a much tighter 30-hour one. At last, I understood what the Strand genre was supposed to be. A game that relies on a community coming together to solve its most challenging tasks and puzzles. A game that offers players a chance to unite, bridging the divides of culture, language, and more to engage cooperatively. And in truth, how is that any different than the final riddle of PT? How is the internet coming together to figure out how to make the baby laugh 3 times any different than using a zipline built by a bunch of strangers to get past the notoriously difficult snow region? Kojima, I would argue, would say that there is indeed no difference, and it is thus that Death Stranding is indeed a spiritual successor to Silent Hills with more than just its imagery, lead actor, and world-famous director-collaborator. Death Stranding 2 is on the way, and it will no doubt double down on these features. But what makes PT Silent Hills so much different than many of the other games I cover here on this channel is that there is room for hope. Most of my other videos are about Night in the Woods and Disco Elysium, 2 games with passionate and dedicated fan bases. But due to real-world situations, neither one will likely ever receive a sequel, or even a spiritual successor. Silent Hills, fortunately, will indeed be getting something of the sort. At the 2023 edition of the Game Awards, Kojima announced that OD, a brand new horror game created in collaboration with director Jordan Peele, will follow Death Stranding. Notably, the reveal included one of PT's most iconic features, the door that leads to the looping hallway, something Kojima himself alluded to on Twitter. While it remains a tragedy that Silent Hills didn't arrive and change the landscape in 2016 or 2017 as it would have if the project had gone forward, OD represents a chance for Kojima and his studio to take those ideas, upgrade them with this decade's technology, cloud features, and more, and maybe even innovate with greater fluidity and imagination than they ever dreamed. Meanwhile, the state of the Silent Hill franchise remains in an odd state of half-life. After letting the series sit on ice for a while, Konami has unleashed a torrent of content for it, including Silent Hill Ascension, a microtransaction-fueled interactive novel that was received poorly by fans, an upcoming main series game titled Silent Hill F, set in Japan as opposed to the typical New England resort town, and most notably, Silent Hill 2, the remake, which is set to drop in October, just about 2 months from now. It was inevitable that Silent Hill 2, arguably the most beloved and highly regarded game in the series, would eventually get a new coat of paint. But the reception has been decidedly mixed. It seems that most folks are interested in the concept of a remake in general, but are concerned about the modernized gameplay, combat, and third-person camera. I'll reserve judgment until the game is released, and I've had a chance to play it. Because although I personally am open to the idea of them bringing some aspects of the game up to speed with the times, I must admit that the clunkiness and the ease with which you could lose your sense of direction was, at times, frustratingly appealing. And remakes, I believe, are difficult to evaluate, in that they must balance exactly these expectations, modernizing where necessary, but still maintaining what made the original so iconic. Whether the remake of Silent Hill 2 is a piece of success or a piece of shit, I look forward to finding out for myself come October 8th. But regardless, as I look back on the state of the Silent Hill franchise, it is tragic to see it either drifting towards the worst vices of the gaming industry here in 2024, like microtransactions, or looking towards the past for a spark. When instead, under different circumstances, they could have been blazing a new trail for the series, and the entire horror genre had Hideo Kojima's Silent Hills been brought to life. Thank you so much for watching my first truly long-form video here on YouTube. I love the Silent Hill franchise. I'll probably make a video on all of the games at some point, even the ones that aren't exactly all that great. And as should be obvious by now, I'm still heartbroken that PT will never see the light of day. and I could think of no better way to honor what the game might have been than to put together this video, and I've enjoyed working on it ever since I thought of the idea back in April. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to let me know. I'm working on essays in a similar style about what remains of Edith Finch and Firewatch. Massive thanks to Mathias T. Taylor, Solice, and David Peppiatt for allowing me to use their covers from the Silent Hill soundtrack for this video. To check out all of their music, just follow the links down below to their channel pages. Big shout out to all my Silver and Gold tier YouTube channel members and Patreon subscribers, including James Pruitt, Corey Matson, Gustavo Balabi, Lil Caesar, Reed, and Pathonian, who get early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time!